Our reading from John today provides some interesting and important, but pretty basic questions about the issues involved with shepherding. Who is the shepherd? How does the shepherd rightfully derive their authority? To what extent does the authority of the shepherd depend on the recognition of the flock? So for a long time, I thought I had clarity on these issues of ministerial authority, and then the pandemic hit, and then Zoom worship happened. At first, doing Zoom worship, I was thrilled when I would see screens with initials or even dark screens with people dialing in, people I didn't know, people I didn't recognize. It felt hopeful. It felt like a possibility. We're reaching people we would never otherwise reach. But then things got a little strange, or to be more precise, I got a little strange. And I started to become obsessed with some of these people who would dial in every single Sunday, but never show their face nor put a real name in the box. I became especially obsessed with someone who just showed up always with the blank screen and the initials PUD. I wanted to know who PUD was. I tried everything I could think of to lure some information out of PUD. I asked in the chat box if people would share their emails. I asked people to change their names on screen. Nothing from PUD. It got worse after our congregation was Zoom bombed twice, once in a racist Zoom bombing, once in a viciously homophobic Zoom bombing. And at this point, I got downright paranoid about PUD. Was PUD one of these thieves and robbers coming to harm my flock? Who was PUD? And then it came that I had to take my cat, her name is Karma, that's a very long story, to the vet, and I'm sitting there in the waiting room of the veterinary hospital trying to talk her into a state of calmness. Wasn't working very well. But I noticed a woman across the way run up and come up to me, and she said, "Reverend Ritchie, you're my minister." A weirdly literal kind of reenaction of John, chapter 10, right? She heard my voice and she came. And we talked for a good long while, and she apologized. She said, "I know, every week I Zoom in just using the initials PUD. I met PUD. And she was lovely. I guess I didn't have to worry about it so much, didn't have to overthink. Our flock know who they are. We know who they are. But in the spirit of overthinking ministry, I did want to share with you some thoughts about that passage from John, as it does describe the responsibilities of ministry, presumably in terms of how they derive from this ultimate image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. The shepherd protects the flock. The shepherd protects the flock from dangers that are both obvious and also implicit. The shepherd is the figure at the swinging gate. And the sheep, well cared for, they know they are safe even in the valley of death, because of the actions of that shepherd. And so it is that as religious people, whatever ministry or whatever leadership it is we want to offer, we want to do that too. We want to stand in right relationship to our flock. We want to use that shepherding as an example and a model. But I wonder if we consider all sides of what it means to be in that position. If we speak only about the responsibilities that the position of shepherd bring, I think we see only half of the whole situation. After all, we are not Jesus, we are not God. So if we shepherd, we are also shepherded. We lead, but we also have to be just as good at following. Our leadership is always derivative. So we have to think about how, yes, we respond to the voice that calls us to duty. But do we respond to the other side of that voice, the voice that calls us to be still and to know God? If we lead our sheep to still waters, have we allowed ourselves to be led to those same restful places? Have we allowed ourselves to be guided by that love that just won't let us go, by that source of being that reminds us we can never be self-derived? So for years, I've noticed at meetings with other religious professionals, ministers in particular, there's a lot of emphasis in talking about how completely terrible we are at self-care. I'm terrible at self-care, people complain. I never quite know how to hear these statements, and I'll just share with you only that sometimes they strike me as a kind of a brag. Look how hard I'm working. Look how much I sacrifice myself for others. In those spaces, I have sometimes been tempted to say, well, actually, I'm pretty good at self-care. I'm feeling fine. I'm rested. I've got some good practices. I'm doing all right. But somehow it didn't feel safe to share that. And in fact, I can only see that as the degree to which I've, too, have internalized this idea that we value our human doing far beyond our human being. And of course, self-care might be especially hard for those of us who have come up in a Protestant tradition. There is an aspect of our tradition that equates our inability to care for ourselves with a kind of moral virtue. A while ago, for another project I was working on, I was reading a great deal of biographies of the most distinguished 19th century American ministers, when I noticed a disturbing trend. So many of these biographies described these ministers that they were lauding as having died from overwork. I do not have the medical expertise to say whether it's possible to die from overwork, but I do know we should not aspire to it. Think of those words. Think of those words from John. Verily, I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs it in another way, is a thief and a bandit. Aren't we thieves and bandits ourselves if we just tried to climb over that fence by virtue of our striving, by virtue of our effort? Aren't we also called to accept the grace of that swinging gate? If you in any way are suspicious of self-care because it seems like a consumerist indulgence, I understand that. But it might be helpful to remember that self-care actually had radical origins. Self-care was never meant to be a $20,000 yoga retreat over a cliff watching the Pacific Ocean come in. The term self-care actually began as a medical term, but it gets popularized in our culture by the Black Panther Party, by Black women authors, and by some feminists, a good number of these people being queer. In 1988, Audre Lorde published a collection of essays that she called A Burst of Light. In those essays, she uses the term self-care to describe those techniques that she used to get through both her personal journey with severe cancer, but also the trauma that she suffered from structural racism and homophobia. Caring for myself, she said, is not a self-indulgence, it's a self-preservation. And as such, it is an act of political warfare. Stephanie Evans is a professor of Black women's studies who has done a lot of work on self-care. And she points out that those original voices urging us to self-care weren't recommending anything expensive, anything that would advance more our enmeshment in capitalism. They were talking about simple, natural movements and exercises. They were talking about spiritual practice, and they were talking about taking pleasures in everyday activities such as eating good but simple food, activities that don't actually cost money. How self-care became consumerized is a long but interesting story, but maybe right now it would be enough for us to remember that it was always a radical notion to survive, especially if you were not meant to survive. So what can we do? Well, perhaps it's just a matter of remembering, of literally putting ourselves back together again. Think of that 23rd Psalm. My Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me to the still waters. Makes, leads. It seems to be anticipated we might have trouble with this. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness in his name's sake. Do you hear that connection? Be restored in your soul is not a deviation from the path of righteousness. It is its first step. So friends, I don't know what you're going through in this season of your life, but I hope you'll heed the good word. Please be gentle with yourselves and your one precious soul.